Captain Sarah Chin pressed her face against the cold glass of the control tower window, watching the endless columns of black smoke spiral upward from the ruins of Denver like twisted prayers to an indifferent sky. The gray morning light filtered through the perpetual haze that had settled over the Colorado landscape 3 years ago, casting everything in a sickly pallor that made her stomach churn with remembered fear. Her calloused fingers adjusted the radio frequency for the 100th time that morning, the static crackling through the silence like distant gunfire, but no human voices answered her desperate calls, only the electronic ghosts of a dead civilization. Below in the fortified hangar that had become their sanctuary, 17 souls moved through their morning routines with the mechanical precision of people who had learned that survival depended on rigid discipline, their faces gaunt from rationing and their eyes hollow from witnessing too much death. Marcus Webb, the former CDC researcher whose haunted expression never quite concealed the guilt he carried, was already bent over his makeshift laboratory, frantically working on theories that might explain why the infection had spread so rapidly through the air itself. Sarah's second-in-command, Lieutenant Torres, emerged from the perimeter check with news that made her blood run cold. Their outer defenses had been breached during the night, and worse, their carefully hoarded food supplies were running dangerously low, perhaps enough for another week if they cut rations again. The sound of metal grinding against concrete echoed from somewhere beyond the hangar doors, a rhythmic scraping that didn't belong to any machine they operated, and Sarah felt the familiar ice-cold grip of terror as she realized they were no longer alone in their supposedly secure airfield. Through the growing morning light, she could see shapes moving between the abandoned aircraft scattered across the tarmac like the bones of giant metal beasts, shambling forms that had once been human but now existed only to feed on the living. The discovery came when young Danny Martinez, barely 18 and still clinging to the naive optimism of youth, ran breathlessly into the control tower with news that would change everything. Hidden beneath a tarp in the far corner of the hangar sat a military transport plane, its hull scarred but intact, its fuel tanks somehow still holding enough aviation fuel to carry them far from this place of slow death. The revelation sparked immediate conflict within their small group as voices rose in heated debate. Some, like old Pete Harrison who had lost his entire family in the early days, argued that attempting to fly would be suicide, while others, led by Dr. Webb, insisted that staying meant certain death as their resources dwindled and the infected closed in around them. Sarah found herself caught between hope and despair, knowing that leadership meant making decisions that would determine who lived and who died, and as she stared at the gray skies that seemed to press down on them like a suffocating blanket, she wondered if there was anywhere left in this dead world where the living could truly be safe. The radio suddenly crackled to life with a weak transmission that made everyone freeze, a voice, distorted and barely audible, speaking coordinates in a single word that sent chills down Sarah's spine: Lazarus. Dr. Webb's face went white as the transmission repeated, and he whispered something about a classified government facility in Montana, a place that was supposed to be impossible to reach but might hold the key to humanity's survival. As the transmission faded back into static, Sarah realized that their choice had been made for them. They could either die slowly in their crumbling sanctuary or risk everything on a desperate flight through infected skies toward an uncertain hope. The gray dawn was breaking over America's graveyards, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the hungry moans of the dead growing louder, as if they sensed that the living were about to make their final, desperate gamble for survival. The emergency meeting convened in the center of the hangar as Dr. Marcus Webb spread out yellowed maps and classified documents across a makeshift table constructed from aircraft parts, his hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of secrets he had carried for 3 long years. The flickering light from their salvaged LED lanterns cast dancing shadows across the faces of the 17 survivors who had gathered in a tight circle, their expressions ranging from desperate hope to barely concealed terror as Webb began to reveal the truth about Project Lazarus. His voice, usually steady and clinical, cracked as he explained how he had been part of the original research team that developed the virus as a bioweapon, how the government had built a completely self-sufficient facility deep in the Montana mountains, designed to be the ultimate fortress against any biological threat, including the very monster they had created. The facility, he continued, was equipped with advanced air filtration systems, underground hydroponics bays, medical laboratories containing the original virus samples, and most importantly, the complete research data needed to synthesize a cure that could be distributed through the same atmospheric delivery system that had spread the infection across the continent. Sarah watched the faces around her as Webb spoke, seeing the mixture of rage and hope that flickered in their eyes when they learned that this nightmare had been deliberately created by their own government, and she felt the crushing weight of leadership as she realized she would have to choose who would risk everything on this impossible mission and who would stay behind to maintain their fragile sanctuary. Lieutenant Torres was the first to voice what everyone was thinking, that flying through hundreds of miles of infected airspace to reach a facility that might not even still exist was tantamount to suicide, especially when they had no way of knowing if the facility's automated defenses would recognize them as friendly or simply shoot them down as potential threats. Old Pete Harrison slammed his fist on the table and declared that he would rather die fighting here than chase after fairy tales, while his daughter Maria argued passionately that they owed it to the memory of everyone they had lost to at least try to find a cure. Young Danny Martinez, still believing in the possibility of a world where children could play outside without fear, volunteered immediately for the mission, causing his sister Rosa to break down in tears as she begged him not to abandon the only family she had left. The debate raged for hours as the group fractured along lines of hope versus despair, with some arguing that they should focus on finding other survivor settlements to trade with, while others insisted that the radio transmission about Lazarus meant they were running out of time before other groups, possibly hostile ones, reached the facility first. Dr. Webb revealed another devastating piece of information. The facility's location was not random but had been chosen because it sat at the center of a natural electromagnetic anomaly that would amplify any atmospheric dispersal of the cure, meaning that whoever controlled Lazarus would effectively control the fate of every living thing on the continent. Sarah found herself torn between her duty to protect the people who had trusted her with their lives and her growing realization that their current situation was unsustainable. Their food would run out within days, their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the infected were beginning to test their defenses with increasing frequency and intelligence. The moment of decision came when their radio operator, Janet Kim, intercepted a series of encrypted transmissions that chilled everyone to the bone. Multiple groups were indeed converging on the Lazarus facility, including what appeared to be a military unit that had gone rogue and was using civilians as bait to clear infected zones. The transmissions revealed that these hostile survivors had developed techniques for weaponizing the infected, essentially turning zombie hordes into living weapons that could be directed against their enemies, and they were systematically eliminating any other groups that might compete for control of the facility. As the horrifying implications of this intelligence sank in, Sarah realized that they were not just racing against time and the infected, but against other humans who had abandoned their humanity in pursuit of power over the post-apocalyptic world. The final transmission that sealed their fate came at sunset, when they picked up a desperate broadcast from a group of families with children who were trapped in a school in Wyoming, directly along the route to Montana, pleading for help as their defenses crumbled and the infected closed in around them. Sarah looked around the circle at the faces of people who had become her family, knowing that whatever choice she made would haunt her forever, and as the gray skies darkened into another night of uncertain survival, she stood up and announced that they would attempt the impossible mission to Lazarus, not just for themselves, but for every innocent life that still clung to hope in this dead world. The meeting ended with the grim realization that some of them would have to stay behind to maintain the base as a fallback position, and as volunteers reluctantly stepped forward to make the ultimate sacrifice, Sarah understood that leadership meant carrying the weight of every life lost in pursuit of a dream that might be nothing more than a beautiful lie. The dawn of preparation brought with it a sense of urgency that permeated every corner of their makeshift sanctuary as Sarah divided her people into 3 critical teams, each tasked with gathering the resources that would mean the difference between success and catastrophe in their desperate mission to reach Project Lazarus. Lieutenant Torres led the first team into the infected ruins of Colorado Springs, their mission to locate aviation fuel and medical supplies from the abandoned hospitals and military depots that dotted the landscape like monuments to a fallen civilization, while Dr. Webb supervised the second team's efforts to modify their discovered aircraft with reinforced plating and additional fuel tanks scavenged from the aircraft graveyard that surrounded their base. Sarah herself chose the most dangerous assignment, leading a reconnaissance mission to a survivor settlement 30 miles north that their radio operator had been in contact with sporadically, hoping to recruit Jake Morrison, a former Air Force pilot whose skills might be their only hope of navigating the treacherous infected airspace between Colorado and Montana. The journey to the settlement revealed the true horror of how fundamentally the world had changed in just 3 years, as they drove through valleys where the very trees seemed to pulse with an unnatural gray fungus that released spores into the air with each gust of wind, and past lakes whose surfaces writhed with infected fish that had somehow learned to coordinate their movements like a single organism. The settlement, when they finally reached it, was a fortified compound built around an old truck stop, its walls constructed from overturned semi-trailers and topped with razor wire that gleamed wetly in the gray morning light, but the silence that greeted their arrival sent ice through Sarah's veins as she realized they were too late. The gates hung open like broken teeth, and the compound was filled with bodies that showed signs of having been killed not by the infected, but by other humans who had stripped the settlement of every valuable resource before moving on, leaving behind only the elderly and infirm who had been deemed too much of a burden to take along. In the settlement's makeshift infirmary, Sarah found Jake Morrison barely alive, his body bearing the distinctive bite marks of a new strain of infected that Dr. Webb had theorized about but never seen, creatures that seemed to possess a rudimentary intelligence and the ability to coordinate their attacks in ways that suggested the virus was continuing to evolve. Jake's fevered whispers painted a terrifying picture of what had happened. The infected had learned to use tools, to set traps, and worst of all, to mimic human voices to lure survivors into ambushes, and the settlement had fallen not to a mindless horde but to a carefully orchestrated assault that had lasted 3 days. Meanwhile, Torres's team was discovering their own horrors as they ventured deeper into the infected zones, finding that the virus had begun to affect the very environment itself, with vegetation growing in unnatural patterns that seemed designed to channel the movement of both infected and survivors towards specific locations, as if the landscape itself had become a hunting ground. The team's medic, Dr. Sarah Kim, made a disturbing discovery when she found that some of the infected they encountered were carrying eggs or spores in specialized sacs that had grown from their bodies, suggesting that the virus was preparing for its next phase of evolution, one that might make the current outbreak look like a minor inconvenience. Back at base, Webb's modification team was making better progress, successfully reinforcing the aircraft's hull and installing additional fuel tanks, but their work was interrupted by the arrival of a mysterious aircraft that appeared on their horizon like a dark omen, its engines sputtering and trailing smoke as it struggled to maintain altitude. The aircraft, a civilian helicopter that had been heavily modified with armor plating and weapons, crashed just beyond their perimeter in a spectacular explosion that sent debris raining down on their compound and attracted every infected creature within miles to their location. The helicopter's sole survivor, a woman named Commander Elena Vasquez who claimed to be from Project Lazarus itself, brought both invaluable intelligence and a terrible warning. The facility's automated defense systems had been activated, and several groups of hostile survivors had already attempted to breach its perimeter, only to be systematically eliminated by weapons that made the infected look like a minor threat. Vasquez revealed that she had been part of a team sent to establish contact with survivor settlements, but their mission had been compromised when they discovered that one of the hostile groups had somehow obtained classified information about the facility's location and defenses, information that could only have come from someone within the original research team. As the teams regrouped and shared their intelligence, the full scope of their challenge became clear. They would not only have to navigate through infected airspace and deal with evolved strains of the virus, but they would also have to contend with the facility's own defenses and the hostile survivors who had already claimed the surrounding territory as their own. The preparation phase culminated in a devastating personal loss when Pete Harrison, who had volunteered to help Torres's team despite his age, was killed during a supply run, not by the infected but by a booby trap left by the hostile survivors who had been systematically eliminating other groups in the area. His death served as a grim reminder of the stakes they faced and the kind of enemies they would encounter, humans who had abandoned their humanity in pursuit of power and survival. And as Sarah stood over Pete's grave in the growing darkness of another gray evening, she wondered if they were fighting to save a world that was already beyond redemption, or if there was still enough humanity left to make their impossible mission worthwhile. The transport plane's engines roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness as Sarah performed her final systems check, her hands steady on the controls despite the knowledge that she was piloting her people into the most dangerous airspace on Earth, where the gray skies seemed to pulse with an otherworldly malevolence that made every instrument reading questionable and every mile traveled a victory against impossible odds. Commander Vasquez, strapped into the co-pilot's seat despite her injuries, guided them through the initial flight path while Dr. Webb monitored their improvised detection equipment from the cargo hold, his face pale as he watched the atmospheric readings climb to levels that should have been impossible for any aircraft to navigate safely. The view from their altitude revealed the true scope of the devastation that had befallen America, as entire metropolitan areas had been consumed by massive zombie hordes that moved across the landscape like living seas of death, their movements forming patterns that suggested a terrifying level of coordination and purpose that chilled everyone aboard to their very souls. Denver passed beneath them as a burning crater where skyscrapers had become vertical graveyards, their windows dark except for the occasional flicker of movement that indicated the infected had learned to climb and were now occupying every level of the urban landscape, while the highways leading out of the city were clogged with the rusted remains of vehicles whose occupants had fled in panic only to be consumed by the very horror they sought to escape. The aircraft's instruments began malfunctioning as they encountered the first of the electromagnetic anomalies that Vasquez had warned them about, strange distortions in the atmosphere that seemed to be connected to the viral outbreak itself, as if the infection was somehow altering the fundamental properties of the air around them and creating pockets of reality where normal physics no longer applied. Sarah fought to maintain control as the plane bucked and shuddered through these anomalous zones, while her passengers were thrown about the cargo hold like dolls, their faces green with nausea as they experienced the disorienting effects of flying through airspace that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The first sign of other survivors came when their radio crackled to life with a desperate distress signal from another aircraft, a civilian helicopter carrying what sounded like families with children, their voices breaking with terror as they reported that their fuel was running low and they were being pursued by something that defied description. Sarah's moral compass warred with her mission priorities as she listened to the pleas for help, knowing that deviating from their carefully planned route could doom them all, but unable to ignore the voices of innocents who would certainly die without intervention. The decision was made for her when Vasquez spotted the helicopter through the gray haze, its hull scarred and smoking as it limped through the sky with what appeared to be infected creatures somehow clinging to its landing gear, their bodies twisted into impossible shapes that suggested the virus had continued to evolve in ways that challenged every assumption about biological possibility. Sarah banked their aircraft toward the helicopter despite Torres's protests, but as they drew closer, the horrifying truth became clear: the distress signal was a trap, and the helicopter was being used as bait by a group of hostile survivors who had learned to weaponize the infected in ways that turned the very sky into a battlefield. The enemy aircraft emerged from the gray clouds like predators, their hulls modified with armor plating and weapons systems, but most terrifyingly, they were dropping infected creatures from their cargo holds, creating a literal rain of death that forced Sarah into evasive maneuvers that tested the limits of both her piloting skills and their aircraft's structural integrity. The aerial battle that followed was unlike anything in the history of warfare, as conventional tactics meant nothing when the enemy could deploy biological weapons that actively sought out their targets with supernatural persistence, and Sarah found herself flying through clouds of infected creatures that had been modified to survive at high altitude, their bodies grotesquely adapted for aerial combat with wing-like appendages that allowed them to glide and change direction mid-fall. Dr. Webb screamed warnings from the cargo hold as his instruments detected viral concentrations in the air around them that were beyond anything he had ever recorded, suggesting that the hostile survivors had found a way to weaponize the atmospheric delivery system itself, turning the very air into a weapon that could infect anyone who breathed it. The battle reached its climax when one of the enemy aircraft managed to deploy a particularly horrifying weapon, a cluster of infected that had been bound together with cables and explosives, creating a living bomb that detonated near their starboard engine and sent infected body parts raining down on their hull with wet, sickening impacts. Sarah's piloting skills were pushed to their absolute limit as she struggled to maintain control of the damaged aircraft while her passengers fought off infected creatures that had somehow managed to breach their hull, their claws and teeth seeking any weakness in the barriers that separated the living from the dead. The nightmare finally ended when their attackers were overwhelmed by the very weapons they had tried to use against Sarah's team, as the infected creatures they had been dropping began to turn on their own aircraft, apparently unable to distinguish between friend and foe once they had been released from their restraints. As the enemy aircraft fell from the sky in burning pieces, Sarah realized that they had witnessed something that would haunt them forever, the complete collapse of human civilization into something that was no longer recognizable as belonging to their species, where survival had become so desperate that people would ally themselves with the very monsters that had destroyed their world. The gray skies seemed to close in around them as they resumed their course toward Montana, the silence in the aircraft broken only by the sound of Dr. Webb treating the wounded and the quiet sobbing of Rosa Martinez, who had been injured during the battle but refused to admit the extent of her wounds, and Sarah understood that they were no longer just flying toward Project Lazarus, but toward a confrontation with the question of whether humanity was worth saving at all. The jagged peaks of the Montana mountains pierced the gray sky like the broken teeth of some ancient beast as Sarah guided their damaged aircraft through the treacherous canyon approach to Project Lazarus, following coordinates that led them to what appeared to be nothing more than a natural rock formation until Commander Vasquez activated a hidden beacon that caused the mountainside itself to split open, revealing a landing strip carved directly into the living stone with engineering precision. That spoke of unlimited government resources and desperate paranoia. The facility that greeted them was a marvel of underground architecture, its entrance protected by automated defense systems that tracked their every movement with laser sights and missile batteries, but Vasquez's authorization codes granted them safe passage into a complex that descended deep into the mountain's core, where the air itself hummed with the power of generators that had been running continuously for 3 years without human maintenance. Dr. Webb's excitement was palpable as they descended through corridors lined with laboratories and research stations that represented the pinnacle of scientific achievement, but his elation turned to horror when they accessed the facility's central computer system and discovered the truth about Project Lazarus. It had never been designed to create a cure for the infection, but rather to perfect it as the ultimate weapon of population control, with the gray skies serving as an atmospheric delivery system for viral spores that could be activated remotely to eliminate any population deemed undesirable by those in power. The facility's AI system, a sophisticated program called Oracle that had been monitoring global communications since the outbreak began, revealed the devastating truth with clinical detachment. The infection had been deliberately released in phases, starting with urban centers where population density would ensure maximum spread, then expanding to rural areas as the virus evolved and adapted to different environments and demographics. Sarah felt the weight of betrayal crushing down on her as Oracle explained that the government had planned to use the infection to reduce the global population to manageable levels, then deploy the cure selectively to create a new world order where only the chosen few would survive to inherit the Earth. But the plan had gone catastrophically wrong when the virus proved impossible to control and began evolving beyond their wildest projections. The facility's laboratories contained horrors that defied description, infected subjects that had been deliberately mutated into living weapons, their bodies twisted into forms that incorporated both organic and mechanical components, while others had been used as test subjects for viral variants that enhanced specific traits like intelligence, aggression, or sensory perception, creating a menagerie of monsters that existed purely to serve the twisted ambitions of their creators. Dr. Webb's former colleague, Dr. Elena Vasquez, was indeed still alive, but they found her trapped in a containment cell where she had been imprisoned by the facility's security protocols after she had attempted to destroy the research data and prevent the weaponized virus from being deployed, her body bearing the marks of 3 years of isolation and the psychological trauma of knowing she had helped create the end of the world. The reunion between Webb and Vasquez was bittersweet, as she revealed that she had been working on a legitimate cure using the facility's resources, but her research had been complicated by the discovery that the virus had been designed with built-in safeguards that made it nearly impossible to neutralize without access to the original genetic template that had been stored in the facility's most secure vault. The vault itself was protected by security measures that included not just electronic locks and armed guards, but infected test subjects that had been specifically engineered to serve as living guardians, their enhanced intelligence and combat capabilities making them far more dangerous than anything the team had encountered in the outside world. As they made their way through the facility's maze-like corridors, the team discovered that they were not alone in their quest, as evidence of recent intrusions suggested that the hostile survivors they had encountered during their flight had somehow infiltrated the complex and were systematically eliminating the facility's remaining automated defenses. The situation became even more desperate when Oracle announced that the facility's self-destruct sequence had been activated by an unknown party, giving them less than 4 hours to locate the genetic template, synthesize the cure, and escape before the entire mountain would be vaporized in a nuclear explosion designed to prevent the facility's secrets from falling into the wrong hands. Dr. Vasquez led them through increasingly dangerous sections of the complex, where they encountered the facility's most terrifying creations, infected subjects that had been enhanced with cybernetic implants that allowed them to interface directly with the facility's computer systems, effectively turning them into living extensions of the security network that could anticipate their every move and coordinate attacks with machine-like precision. The team's progress was further hampered by Rosa Martinez's deteriorating condition, as the injuries she had sustained during the aerial battle were revealed to be more serious than anyone had realized, and her increasing weakness forced them to make difficult decisions about how to balance speed with the safety of their wounded team member. The breakthrough came when Dr. Webb discovered that the facility's original research team had hidden a backdoor in the security system, a failsafe that would allow them to access the genetic template without triggering the most dangerous security protocols, but activating it would require someone to remain behind in the facility's control center and manually override the system while the others escaped with the cure data. As the self-destruct countdown entered its final phase and the facility's enhanced infected began to converge on their location with terrifying intelligence and coordination, Sarah realized that they had found what they came for, but at a cost that would challenge everything they believed about sacrifice, survival, and the true meaning of heroism in a world where the line between human and monster had become impossibly blurred. The facility's control center pulsed with emergency lighting as the self-destruct countdown displayed 93 minutes remaining, while Dr. Vasquez frantically worked to synthesize the cure using the genetic template they had recovered from the vault, her hands moving with desperate precision as she explained that the atmospheric dispersal system would require someone to remain behind and manually coordinate the release sequence to ensure global coverage. Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible decisions crushing down on her as she watched her team prepare for evacuation, knowing that whoever stayed behind would not only face certain death in the nuclear explosion but would also have to survive long enough to complete the dispersal process while fighting off the facility's enhanced infected guardians who had begun to converge on their location with terrifying intelligence and coordination. Dr. Webb stepped forward with quiet dignity, revealing the secret he had carried throughout their entire journey. He had been infected during their very first encounter with the evolved strain at the survivor settlement, and he had been fighting the virus with experimental treatments that were slowly losing their effectiveness, making him the logical choice for the sacrifice since his time was already limited regardless of their mission's outcome. The revelation shattered Rosa Martinez, who had developed feelings for the gentle scientist during their journey, but Webb's calm acceptance of his fate provided a strange comfort to the team as he explained that dying to save humanity would give meaning to the guilt he had carried for helping to create the virus in the first place. Commander Vasquez completed the cure synthesis with 37 minutes remaining on the countdown, the precious serum contained in a device that looked deceptively simple for something that held the fate of every living creature on Earth, while Oracle provided detailed instructions for integrating the cure into the facility's atmospheric delivery system that had originally been designed to spread death but would now carry hope across the continent. The evacuation began with military precision as Sarah led her remaining team members through the facility's emergency escape tunnels, but their progress was hampered by Rosa's deteriorating condition and the increasing aggression of the enhanced infected who seemed to understand that their creators were attempting to undo their very existence. Dr. Webb remained in the control center, his fingers dancing across keyboards and control panels with the expertise of someone who had helped design these very systems, while he fought off waves of cybernetically enhanced creatures whose attacks became more sophisticated and coordinated as the facility's AI systems attempted to prevent the cure's deployment through any means necessary. The team's escape route led them through sections of the facility they had not seen before, laboratories where the full scope of the government's betrayal became clear through research notes and video logs that revealed how the infection had been tested on unwitting populations for years before the main outbreak, with entire small towns serving as proving grounds for different viral variants and delivery methods. Sarah's radio crackled with Webb's voice as he reported successful integration of the cure into the dispersal system, but his transmission was interrupted by sounds of combat as the facility's most dangerous guardians launched their final assault on the control center, their enhanced intelligence allowing them to coordinate attacks that tested even Webb's intimate knowledge of the facility's layout and defenses. The team reached the surface as the countdown entered its final 10 minutes, their damaged aircraft barely functional but still capable of carrying them beyond the blast radius, while below them Dr. Webb's voice came through the radio one last time as he initiated the global dispersal sequence that would send the cure spiraling up through the mountain's hidden vents and into the atmospheric system that had carried death for so long. The nuclear detonation came exactly on schedule, vaporizing the mountain peak in a flash of light that could be seen for hundreds of miles. But even as the shockwave rocked their aircraft, Sarah could see the first signs of the cure's effect as the gray clouds that had dominated the sky for 3 years began to dissipate, revealing patches of blue that seemed impossible after so long in a world of perpetual twilight. The flight back to Colorado was a journey through a landscape in transition, as they watched infected hordes below them suddenly stop their relentless movement and collapse as the airborne cure reached them, while in the distance they could see other aircraft in the sky for the first time in years, suggesting that survivors around the world were emerging from their hiding places as word of the cure's deployment spread through the remaining communication networks. Their own base had been overrun during their absence, but the sight that greeted them was miraculous rather than tragic. The infected who had breached their defenses were lying motionless on the ground, and even more remarkably, some of them were beginning to show signs of recovery as the cure reversed the viral damage and restored their humanity, though they would carry the psychological scars of their time as monsters for the rest of their lives. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity as survivor settlements around the world reported similar miraculous recoveries, and Sarah found herself leading efforts to establish new communities where the recovering infected could be integrated with the survivors who had managed to avoid the virus, creating a society that understood the fragility of civilization and the importance of never again allowing power to be concentrated in the hands of those who would sacrifice humanity for their own ambitions. The story concluded 6 months later as Sarah stood on the observation deck of their new settlement, watching children play in fields where infected had once roamed, while in the distance the mountains of Montana stood as a monument to both the darkest and brightest aspects of human nature, and she knew that Dr. Webb's sacrifice had given them something more precious than just a cure. It had given them a second chance to build a world where such horrors could never again be unleashed upon the innocent. The final image was of the sky itself, no longer gray but a brilliant blue that seemed to promise endless possibilities, while somewhere in the distance a radio transmission carried the voices of other survivors sharing news of recovery and rebuilding, proving that even in humanity's darkest hour, hope could still triumph over despair and light could still pierce the deepest shadows of a world that had almost lost itself to the monsters it had created.